Copenhagen. Oh yeah, Copenhagen. Do you have something from Copenhagen? Copenhagen. Where's Copenhagen? Where's Copenhagen? It's Copenhagen. Stop.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, folks.
How are you?
I've been better. I'm having some difficulties. Yeah, but we're not going to let that stop us. We've got Kierkegaard to talk about and John Wesley to talk about, and mostly Christian love, which of course, is the best in my opinion. Of course, I love Kierkegaard as well. So I appreciate all of your prayers, and I hope that you can continue to keep me in your prayers. So how is everyone? Did you all have good breaks?
Don't everyone speak at once?
I had an intensive, so it was
Oh,
not much of a break.
Oh, certainly not. No.
I think I've learned my lesson, though.
Yeah, not to do intensives?
Just not in the middle. When I signed up for it, I told Jess that I was doing that, and she's like, "Ooh, you're doing it in the middle?" I was like, "Well, yeah." So, well, you might like it, but I did not like it. And so, I mean, it was 50-50, but I bet with kids and everything, I might not do it in the middle this time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Well, let's go ahead and begin. So today we're going to have, because I am really pretty still recovering, and Amber has an expert on John Wesley, being a United Methodist and having taken a class on Wesley recently, or a couple of them. She's going to share with us a little bit about Wesley's sermon about love. And, Wesley's got some, that's really, I think, one of his main focuses is love. Actually, I would say that's his main focus, is Christian love. And how does Christian love play itself out? How do we know that we are loved, and how do we participate in God's love for others? I think many of you in your core values also mentioned that love was important. It is one of your core values. So let's go ahead and begin. Does anybody have anything else to say real quick before we begin the class? Okay. So let's take a few moments and just center ourselves. I had a quote for today from Hafiz. And Hafiz, I love Hafiz. Does anybody familiar with Hafiz? Yes, Adrian, yes. Yeah. So this is one of my favorite quotes from Hafiz. Let's center ourselves and quiet the mind. And still, after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky. And still, after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look at what happens with a love like that. It lights up the whole sky. Welcome back from your break to A Christian Theology. Sort of feel like Steve Colbert in A Late Show, live in person on tape. Not on tape. Anyway, thank you all for your well wishes, and I, in continuing to have some issues, so I ask for your continued prayers, please. Today we're going to talk about Christian love. Amber's going to talk about John Wesley, and then we'll have Jared Reed, who is a MTS student. He's almost done with his coursework, and he is going to be writing his dissertation, and not his dissertation, his master's thesis, and he's writing his master's thesis on Kierkegaard, which he told me the first time I met him when he first entered. Before classes started, when he entered, I asked him what he was interested in. He said, "Oh, so you're interested, what are you interested in?" He said, "Kierkegaard." And so I was very happy because I love Kierkegaard. So he will share, and I've let him know that only a very special person could be doing the Kierkegaard section, because no one ever does the Kierkegaard section. I often want to have different voices come in, and so people will come in and speak about different topics or different authors, but it's the first time anybody's ever come in to talk about Kierkegaard. So, and I hope that that the reading guide has been helpful, and also you'll notice in the Populi, not only is there the reading guide, but there's also notes from the class for this particular period. And Jared, I think will go over that as well, because I think that's a good to get a good foundation of what Kierkegaard is talking about in the beginning there with the you. What does you mean? Shall, actually shall is first. You shall love your neighbor. What does it mean that it's duty? You shall love your neighbor. Who is your neighbor? Is it the person who lives next door whose dog keeps you up at night? Is it somebody you've never met? Is it somebody across the country? Who's the neighbor? And then you shall love. What does it do to you? What does it mean for you to love through God, with God, and be loved, because you are also a neighbor? Anyway, so he's going to talk some more about that. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Amber, and I'm going to lay low here. I'll be listening, but I'm having some issues, so I'm just going to lay low here. So, and if anybody has any questions, you can let me know, but I'm sure everybody will. Things are in good hands. All right. And James, you're here with us, aren't you? I can't see you, so okay. All right. Thank you. Amber?
Right. Thank you, Dr. Russell. Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you all today. So I know a couple of you are fellow Wesleyans, so hopefully this will be meaningful to you guys as well. John Wesley, as you may recognize from your Christian history classes, is one of the founders of Methodism, which is my denomination, United Methodist Church. And one of the things I grew up knowing about God was that God is love. The one thing that was, when someone asked of me, what did I know about God? Well, God is love. I remember the little Vacation Bible School songs, Jesus Loves Me, and love God as yourself, or love God as you. That was a trick question. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. This was all before I came to seminary and before I knew John Wesley's focus on love. So I think that is a little bit of a testament both to the Holy Spirit who moves through the things we do, as well as how the Methodist Church has continued on through today, promoting love. Now, that isn't to say we were real good at it the whole time, because we've really struggled at what it means to love and to love each other and to love our neighbor. And we are still doing that even today. Go figure. And so I think it is really timely that we're going to talk about John Wesley today and his take on love. And one thing in particular is his Sermon 91 on charity. So John Wesley was really big on publishing, and he did a lot of publishing, writing and publishing, and he had a lot of sermons, and this is just one of them. In many, many, many of his sermons, I can't say all because I've not read all of his sermons, but many of them all have love as some sort of guest that shows up in them all. And so this one in particular on charity is the one we're going to look at a little closer today. So let me try to, Dr. Russell, it's not letting me share screen here.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Yes, multiple, of course.
Okay, there we go. Let me find the right one. All right. It's not giving me the option here to, is it? Hang on. Maybe if I do this and this. There we go.
Is it working?
Yes, I got it.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you. Okay, let me get to the slideshow here. There we go. Okay. So, goodness, it's not in the right spot. Sorry about that, everyone. It's all good until it's not, isn't it? All right. Patience is a virtue. Is anything showing up on your end yet?
Yeah, so we have a blank thing.
Okay.
So what we might need to do is you need to stop sharing and then find the thing that you want to share and then share again, because it's Zoom is a little
Okay.
It doesn't let you change your mind. What would that make it? I don't know. I was make a comment about Calvin, but I won't, because it's not really about Calvin.
Okay, well, it is just spinning out here.
Do you want to send it to me and I can
Yeah, if I can get to it. It's like it's not wanting to go, it's not wanting to connect via the web. All right, let's see if this.
Well, all you need to do is have it up on your screen, and then you can share screen, and then you ought to be able to.
Correct. That's the problem. It's when there it is. When I was pulling it up, all it was doing was thinking.
Oh, I see.
You know, I got the little spinning thing.
Oh yeah, the spinning thing. Thinking. Well, while
Okay.
Amber's doing that, we might just reflect upon Christian love.
Here we go. I'm ready.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. Here we go, guys. All right. Are you with me?
Yes.
Okay. Here we go. From beginning. On charity. John Wesley, Sermon 91. So John Wesley, now it's not moving on. Oh, oh gosh. Okay, well, John Wesley tells us that charity means something in particular. Does anybody remember what that word is?
Love.
That's right, it is love. And he goes on to tell us that somewhere in 1969, he thought the word which originally showed as agape, or agapein technically, in the New Testament was changed from love to agape. And it's a little humorous, I think, that he points out that it just caused nothing but confusion since then. But because of that confusion, some people are confused on what it means to love, or what this charity means within within the Bible. So agape, I'm trying to remember now. I'm so sorry, guys. Seriously, I practiced this all over the place.
Amber, just take a deep breath. We've all given presentations that have gone in the toilet quickly. So
it is so annoying, isn't it?
you're stressing me out. Don't stress out. Just take a deep breath. It's all good.
Yes, it's fine, Amber. You're doing great. John Wesley talks about love, and so agape is a selfless kind of love.
Yes.
It's different from another kind of love, which might be kind of a pathos or a romantic love, or eros. I guess that's right, eros. But then there's also a love of neighbor. So agape is often seen as God's love for us and our love for God. But it isn't filio, which is our friendships, and it isn't eros, according to Wesley. That might be different according to other theologians, but does that help?
And as you mentioned, love is for our neighbor. He also mentions that love is for some other things and people too. What are some things that Wesley uses to describe what love is? Have you guys picked up on any of those? Like love is for our neighbor, but who else is love for?
Tangelo.
That's right, Tangelo. Perla back here, she's sleeping, my kitty. Only Christians? No, all Christian, all people.
All people.
So love is for both Christians and non-Christians. And those of you who have gone through a marriage ceremony, if you remember some of the love is pieces that came through the marriage vows, like love is humble, or in Wesley's terms, not puffed up. Love is not provoked or gentle. Love is long suffering, resigned, or enduring, in my words. I think Wesley also uses resignation a lot. I think he also used enduring. So this is a type of love that isn't pain-causing exactly, which is kind of what long suffering brings to my mind. But it is that type of love that's in it for the long haul. We're not just going to throw in the towel at the first bump in the road that we run into. And when we love our neighbor, that there's sure to be bumps in the road. Sometimes when we love our neighbor who's in the house with us, our family members, there are a lot of bumps in the road there. And so having a love that is enduring is very important to Wesley's philosophies in life. Not being humble, or not being puffed up, which is being humble in love. Can any of you guys give me an example of how that might show love towards someone?
Oh, Zach unmuted. He's much more wise, but I was going to say, if you're not humble, you're not boastful or boasting, and so if you can take a back seat and let somebody have ideas or have an opinion that displays a love, and it's humble of you to back off or back seat.
Yeah, good.
I think maybe that's what I should have done when Zach unmuted. I should have humbly took a back seat to display some love for the neighbor, right? That would be like a Zoom kind of love.
Then how could I have done that for you, though? Yeah, right on. I would have just said, believing that no one is below you, that everyone is equal, putting them higher than yourself in some ways as well. So, no status that's lower than you, but equality across the board.
Well, if I can interrupt for a second, is that okay, Amber?
Yes, please do.
I mean, I think it's interesting to note, because we'll see a difference here with Kierkegaard. And what Zach, you just said, was not putting yourself above anyone else. So not loving yourself more than others, but then you also said loving others more than yourself. And I think that's really hard to do, particularly if we're talking about someone you're not married to, or is your kid, or someone you're connected to. But it's something that Kierkegaard will say is there isn't a neighbor over self or self over neighbor, but they're loved to the same degree. So just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, so this next.
I was gonna.
Yes, go ahead.
I was gonna say that I think the love that we're talking about, and humble love, can be shown through forgiveness and apologizing as well. And it kind of goes off what Jackie was saying about taking a back seat, or putting, not putting your own hurts, I guess, above, like somebody's wrongdoing, or I don't know. Forgiveness and apologizing just came to my mind when you were talking.
That's good. Because a lot of times that is quite important when we're trying to show love towards others, when we're trying to make amends, when we're trying to take the next step in a relationship with someone. And in fact, that's really kind of what God did, right? So in the next step here, I'm going to see if I can share this at this point one last time. You guys probably can't see that yet, can you? Because I'm not sharing. All right, I'm going to try again, Dr. Russell. I've been downloading.
Okay.
See if that helps. All right, y'all can see that. See, look at this. See the beautiful PowerPoint I had for you guys.
There we go. Yeah.
We were going to be popping right through these things, but at least we got to the stair steps, because Wesley tells us that as we're leading into love, there are certain other things that might come into love. And he calls it a beautiful gradation, each step rising above the other in the enumeration of those several things which some or other of those that are called Christians really believe will supply the absence of love. And that is a big mouthful of an old way of saying that all these things could be a part of love. But for Wesley, they don't equal to love. And so one of those things was eloquence. Here he's talking about the speech. Someone may talk a good talk, but it means nothing if they're not also walking the walk, right? Knowledge, that's another piece of that. You might have a very good understanding of faith and love, but again, if you're not putting it into action, what good is knowledge? But knowledge is a little bit more than just talking, right? Because at least you've taken the next step. But beyond knowledge, we do have faith. And in faith is love. So Wesley sees the faith that we have in God, in Jesus, which is then empowering us to go a bit further yet. And that brings us to good works. So for Wesley, he was fond of calling works of mercy is some grace, that a type of grace that God provides for us. And so good works could be in public or could be private and include compassion and justice for our neighbor. And then there's the resignation, which we spent some time talking on already. The resignation that allows us to step back and humble ourselves before another person, showing that it doesn't always have to be our way is the right way, allowing other people to have their moment to share the things that are on their heart that the Spirit would like to bring forth from that person. And we allow that by our resignation or by, being humble, allowing them to step forward. And at the very top, of course, is love, without which none of these other things really matter if we don't have love. And so that all kind of wraps up into his sermon. If we haven't love, then the faith, what good is faith? What good is our works if we're not showing forth the love to our neighbor? And so for John Wesley, he said true religion is nothing if not holy tempers. Did anyone catch or look up, or maybe Jackie and Zach know, in which case I'm cheating, but you guys, the rest of you guys might know too. What are holy tempers? I had to look it up. So I'm not expecting really any of you to know, but just take a shot, knowing we're talking about love. And love is an important thing to John Wesley. What might be a holy temper? I'll give you a hint. There's like 7 or 9 of them, depending on which translations you're used to using. You might know them as fruits. So the holy tempers for Wesley are fruits of the Spirit. And these are all out of Galatians 5:22 through 23. So for Wesley, any true religion, he's not even putting this into Christianity. He's recognizing that other religions that have similar types of tempers, he is calling them true religions. And I might be expounding a little bit, but I don't think that's too far from what Wesley originally meant. True religion is nothing short of holy tempers. And I think if you look deep enough into a lot of other religions, you'll see quite a few of these things in there. Joy, peace, kindness, self-control, perseverance is in there. So a lot of our true religions are bringing these forward. And so anything less is vanity. We just end it with anything less is vanity. Can any of you guys throw out there some ideas on why does Wesley think anything less than showing holy tempers is vanity? Why is anything showing less than love just vanity?
I think it has to do with the centrality that he puts on love, following Paul's writing on that. If you don't have love, everything else is moot. It's not truly of God if it's not of love, I guess, would be the way I took it.
I think just his connection with this humbleness, and connection with love. So you don't have to be, I'm trying to word this correctly. You don't necessarily have to be, wow. Let me just say, humble is equal to love for him. So it's like, if you don't love, you're not being humble. So you're being prideful. And that's where the vanity, I think, comes from. I was trying to word it in my head and it didn't go together. So forgive me, y'all.
That's okay. Thank you.
I think too, looking at where he wrote, nothing is higher than this but Christian love, the love of our neighbor flowing from the love of God, that the love that he's describing it flows out of the love that God has for us and the love that we have for God. And so the love of neighbor, in a sense, then is simply a byproduct of that type of divine, all-encompassing, unconditional love, similar to what Kierkegaard was describing, I think.
Good. Thank you. Anyone else?
And just when we're trying to work out of love that is not flowing from that, then that's when it's arrogance, because there is no greater love than that. And we're trying to do it on our own.
I think if we're not operating out of the love that comes from God that flows through us, then we could be operating out of love that's not selfless and instead self-serving or for a self-serving aim.
Yeah, good. Now, I'm kind of leading in here now, but I'm hoping some of this stuff, I'm trying to connect it into what I'm thinking Jared might be pulling through in Kierkegaard. There are some differences, but I suppose when we're talking about love, there's a few different things we can be talking about, like Dr. Russell was mentioning earlier. You guys have pointed out some very good ones. Yeah, so when Wesley, you remember me talking a little bit earlier about works of piety and works of mercy, which mean more to me, I think, at this point, because I've been steeped in doctrine and history for the past several months. But those are just old English ways of talking about ways that we have worship and devotion and compassion and justice. So mercy being compassion and justice on the one hand, and worship and devotion being piety on the other. There are both public and private ways of doing all of those things. So as you're kind of contemplate what it means to have piety and mercy for our neighbor, or for others, or just in general, in the realm of love, what do you think represents love best? piety, which is worship and devotion. You're loving God with your heart, soul, and mind. Or works of mercy, which are compassion and justice. I think Adrian might have spoken to this a little bit before.
So you're saying piety, which one's more important?
Well, for you, there's no right or wrong answer here necessarily. There's going to be things you draw from to lead to your answer, but this is just up for discussion. What do you guys think is more important? Is one more important than the other? Why or why not?
I think worship and devotion, or the work of piety, helps me I think it helps me to think about
Sorry about that.
offering more love, like loving my neighbor. So when I'm more in worship and I'm more in devotion, I'm more aware of how best I'm called to love my neighbor. I don't think that's answering your question. I'm not saying that one is better of love. I'm just saying, for me, the act of piety helps me to channel and remember that I need to love all neighbors, not just those that I like.
Thank you. Go ahead, James.
I was gonna give it back to Terea. Why you gotta make me the selfish lover? I was trying to do what Zach did for Jackie. I think, kind of like Jackie, I think piety is probably more important, just because I always think about like faith without works is dead. And that kind of goes into, for me at least, I feel like the works in love is something that happens from relationship. Like I want to do good works because of the love that I've received and that I know. I'm not just doing things just cause. But that time in piety is that time where it's like that's my foundation. That's my where I'm building my love with God, and that's me and Him in relationship. Whereas then the good works is me taking that love He's shown me and the love to others. So it's like that's my starting point. And even as I was thinking about piety, it just looks different for everybody. So when I almost got hung up because I had to look it up real quick because I was like, what is piety again, really? And when I look at the definition and it talking about the quality of being religious, it actually struck me oddly now because I'm like, I don't know about this word religious, because some of the things that I think we do with our connection to God isn't necessarily the orthodox type of things for our religion. Some people pray, some people do dance or do other things. So piety was kind of like here with me, if that's the right word that I would describe it as. But I definitely think the works comes through as like a second aspect of love. It's a product of love, like you said.
Thank you. Very good. And that Dr. Russell is going to have you guys talk about some things in more depth next week after you've had the presentation with Kierkegaard. And speaking of, Jared Reed is here now to introduce. Well, you've already had an introduction with Soren Kierkegaard, but he's here to help bring him more to life for you. Hi, Jared. How are you doing?
Hey, Amber. Hey, how's everybody going? I'm Jared Reed. I am a third-year Master's of Theological Studies student, working on my thesis, which is partially about Kierkegaard right now. And actually, I am surprised. I don't think I've had class with any of you so far. So if you don't mind, real quick, if we could just go through and get a little roll call of who everybody is, why they're here, what degree program they're in, that'd be great.
So let's start. I'm just going to start on my screen, and I'm pointing at Mary Beth, though Mary Beth probably can't see that. So let's start with Mary Beth.
Hi, I'm Mary Beth Mullen. I'm from Terre Haute, and I'm an MDiv student, second year.
Jackie.
Hi, I'm also from Terre Haute, which is exceedingly unusual in these calls. And I'm an MDiv student as well, third semester. And anxious to hear your review on the book, kind of an outline. So thank you for your time.
Of course.
Zach.
I'm Zach LaCrone. I'm a first year MDiv student. Looking forward to your presentation.
Adrian.
Yes, I'm Adrian. I'm a first semester MDiv student.
And oh,
James. Sorry, it wouldn't unmute.
Hi, I'm James Rogers. I'm a first year, second semester MDiv student.
Tareya.
Good afternoon. I'm Tareya. I am a second semester dual student, MDiv, and clinical mental health counseling.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, fantastic.
Thank you. And thank you, Jared, for being here with us.
Oh, of course, no problem. And so I heard, so you guys already had a general introduction to Kierkegaard, and
No, we haven't had any introduction to Kierkegaard. They've only had an introduction to John Wesley. So,
okay.
you know, I mean, I didn't even tell them that Kierkegaard was a Taurus.
Oh, okay. See, that's important.
Yeah, you know.
Okay, well, I'll be happy to give you guys that, to give you more
Perfect.
context.
That's
So
great. Thank you.
So Søren Kierkegaard, Søren Abbe Kierkegaard, if you want to say the right Danish pronunciation, at least so I hear, is, both me and Helene will talk our heads off about him, but he's one of my favorite philosophers for a reason. I discovered him when I was a teenager, not due to anything I read from high school, just on my own, just trying to figure out things. He's important because he lived in an age that tried to rationalize everything, and I think he takes faith back to its core and what it means for us as Christians, especially as individual Christians with their own subjective life experiences and consciousness, while at the same time holding on to the importance of truth. So Kierkegaard was born in 1813 and around Copenhagen in Denmark. His father, Michael, supposedly cursed God, and he always felt like he was responsible for his father's sins because of that. He grew up in an age which I won't bore you with the details, but if you've ever heard of the name William Friedrich Hegel, or just Hegel, the first half of 19th century philosophy was dominated by essentially the thought of this one man who had a very systematic, rational way of kind of sorting out everything in the world. And everybody just kind of went with it, like, this is the truth. This is how we're going to interpret everything from now on. And sorry about that. And Kierkegaard had to grow up in the sort of shade of this. He went to university where this thought was dominant. It was dominant in theology, it was dominant in history, the sciences, philosophy, everything you could think of. And so he rails against it quite a bit. And he also, probably the other, I would say, key point in his life would be his unrequited love with Regine Olsen, which was a young lady that he was engaged to and broke off with for reasons we're not exactly sure of, but something to do with what he said was his melancholy. So Kierkegaard definitely have what we would call today a major depressive disorder. And maybe as a middle class white male with depression and issues with being terminally single and probably overthinking things, maybe that's why I related to him so much. I don't know. I also kind of have the hair too, I suppose. But so Kierkegaard lived a pretty solitary life. He was very Lutheran, lived in a very Lutheran country, which was another thing he railed against, was the idea of Christianity being a given. Christianity almost being like an ethnicity. It's something you're just born into. It's something we assume. It's just kind of everywhere. Especially in Section 2 and Works of Love, when he's talking about how the poet is opposed to the Christian conception of love, you could see his railing against the idea of Christendom, the idea of Christianity being like a civilization and not something we all have to individually choose, and an idea that is quite radical and is always going to be radical, even if we're born into a so-called Christian country or a Christian culture. It's something that individually and collectively we have to choose to take because we were all pagans once. And so he spends the last few years of his life, he died at the ripe old age of 42, railing against the state church of Denmark in both public and private discourses, and dies due to complications from a head injury he had as a child, and doesn't even see his own brother on his deathbed. So that's a short outline of Kierkegaard's life. If you ever hear the term existentialism, that's from Kierkegaard. He doesn't use the term, but everything he states and all of his main conceptions of what it means to find meaning in life and be an individual person, making conscientious choices of how you're going to live and find meaning in your life, that all comes from Kierkegaard. So he's rightly regarded as the father of what's called existentialism or existentialist philosophy. So to give you that, kind of broad outlook, let's get to the reading for today. I'm going to try to I'm just going to kind of go through it pretty simply using the reading guide as a bit of a touch point. And if you didn't read it, I'm not going to judge. If I didn't do all the readings, I would not have any of my degrees. So I am just going to hopefully give you a basic summary, and we could use that as a launch board for discussion, right? So it's going to be pretty relaxed, no need to fear. Let's start off then with the prayer at the very beginning, which is very important. I'm just going to read it out loud to you because it's very short, and so everybody will have something to jump off from. How could love be rightly discussed if you were forgotten, O God of love, source of all love in heaven and on earth? You who were spared nothing but gave all in love. You who are love, so that one who loves is what he is only by being in you. How could love properly be discussed if you were forgotten? You who made manifest what love is, you, our Savior and Redeemer, who gave yourself to save all. How could love be rightly discussed if you were forgotten, O Spirit of love? You who take nothing for your own, but remind us that sacrifice of love. Remind the believer to love as he is loved, and his neighbor as himself. O eternal love, you who are everywhere present and never without witness, wherever you are called upon, be not without witness in what is said here about love, or about the works of love. There are only a few acts which human language specifically and narrowly calls works of love. But heaven is such that no act can be pleasing there unless it is an act of love, sincere and self-renunciation, impelled by love itself, and for this very reason, claiming no compensation. So just hearing that again, or hearing it for the first time, is there anything that stands out to you? Do you have anything that pulled on your heartstrings, or anything you noticed about the structure of the poem itself? Don't go all
I
in.
made a note of him mentioning or the belief that God is the source of love. And I think that relates to the conversation we were just having about piety and us, being filled with God's love in order to allow it to flow through us. So
Fantastic. Yes, excellent point. Yep. Remember, yeah, it's always being addressed to God, often in the first person, talking to God, like, face to face. And sorry, let me get back to it for a second here. Yeah, and the important point is that God that God is the source of love for Kierkegaard in everything. It's so yeah, as Helene mentioned, and in the reading guide too, think of a Trinitarian structure that which actually I probably should have highlighted the portions of it where it says that, but actually, Helene, I'm sorry. I apologize. I forget. Where did you say were the key Trinitarian kind of
Well, I think that prayer that he begins is Trinitarian.
right?
He's-
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking? So there's a father part, there's an element of prayer being addressed to God the Father, although he doesn't say it exactly, but and then God the Creator, and God the Savior, and God the Sanctifier, or God the Sustainer.
I see. Yep.
So
Okay.
I think that's really interesting because for Kierkegaard, he's being Trinitarian, of course, but that love itself has this tripartite
Mm-hmm.
movement. There's a dynamism to it.
Yep. Absolutely.
Interrelationality. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, so let's move on. Then, so is there any reflections on that? Any thoughts about the Trinitarian nature of love, or?
Well, I was kind of looking at that too. I don't think I would have noticed it without the notes. But when the reading guide said to note the Trinitarian structure of prayer, acknowledging, I think as everyone, or as Dr. Russell was saying, that God as the source of love. Then he goes into Christ as Savior, and the Holy Spirit as the Spirit of love, and just the foundational relationship, the relationality, I guess, of that, the Trinity, and how the ground of love then basically is relational when he goes on to talk about the relationship that we have with God and the relationship that we have with the neighbor as well. Oh, and our relationship with ourselves.
Yes, fantastic. So let's go on then to section 1. So how are we to know love? Because love seems hidden. It seems so personal. Well, I mean, we have both the biblical example and also in the reading itself, Kierkegaard is talking about the fruits of love. Love will be shown in how it manifests in your life. And this becomes a theme repeated when he talks about the neighbor. You know your neighbor by doing the duty of your neighbor. That is, especially for Kierkegaard, this philosophy is supposed to be something, this isn't just an abstract book. And granted, he purposely writes in a difficult way at times to kind of, make you think and play around with words and concepts. But this is supposed to be something that you actually apply to your life. And love isn't love if it is not being applied. And love isn't love if it isn't truly anchored in God, whether consciously or unconsciously. Because God can't change. God is consistent. It's not a spur of the moment emotion. So yeah, let's talk about that more. Let's talk about love as fruits. We can only know someone's love by the fruits that they produce. Would you agree with that? Or do you have examples of that? I mean, it sounds almost common sense, especially in a Christian context, but maybe we could challenge that or offer any rebuttals to that. Does everybody kind of agree with that point that Kierkegaard makes here? Yes. Okay. Good. If I don't know if any of you saw the movie, it was in the 90s, Contact. But with Carl, it's about a book. It was excuse me, it was
Carl
a
Sagan.
film of a book by Carl Sagan, and during part of the movie is that, if I remember correctly, they ask one of the main characters, like, well, can you prove you love someone, right? Like, can I objectively prove to you that I love my spouse or what have you? In a sense, you really can't. So, and that's what makes love hidden in a sense. We only see its outward reflections, and everything else is internal. It's the deepest self, as Kierkegaard notes. And ultimately, it's in God, the most unseen thing of it all, but also the all within all. So, going on from
Can I
that.
interrupt just for a second, Jared?
Of
Because I
course,
think
yeah.
what your point here is really helpful and important is, and I love the fact that you brought in Carl Sagan.
Mhm.
He was my hero as a kid. And anyway, so love is known. We experience love because we are loved. And it's not just I mean, it's a duty, but then it's the way he's describing duty actually that'll make the difference.
Mm.
But if we can't necessarily know for sure that the actions that someone is doing are because of love. And that's particularly, I think, important for Kierkegaard when we are thinking about our own actions. Like when we're trying to say, oh, well, I love this person, or I did something loving to this person, or my neighbor, or something, because we don't really know that unless we're allowing God or engaging with God to have our own thought of what would be loving be transformed or transfigured by God's love. Did that make it more confusing or less?
Does anybody have comments on that or agree with that? That help? It's okay if it makes it more confusing. That's sometimes the point. Here, actually, I did, to maybe illustrate this, I did have a quote down on page 26 and 27 for those who have their books by you and you're using this edition specifically. I'm going to just read it in full again. As God dwells in the light from which streams every beam, which lights the world, and yet no one can penetrate back by these paths to see God, for the path of light changes to darkness when one torch turns the light. So love dwells in the hidden or the innermost depths, as the flow of a spring lures by the murmuring persuasion of its rippling, yes, almost begs one to go along the path, and not curiously wish to penetrate in to discover its source and reveal its secrets. As the rays of the sun invite men to observe by their help the glory of the world, but reproachfully punish with blindness and with blindness the presumptuous, and try to turn about in order inquisitively and impudently to discover the origin of light. As faith beckoning offers to be man's companion on one's life, but turns to stone the imprudent who in turn imprudently try to grasp it, so it is the desire for the prayer of love that its concealed source and its hidden life in the most inward depths may remain a secret, so that no one inquisitively and imprudently will disturbingly thrust his way in to see what he cannot see anyway, the joy and blessing of which, however, he forfeits by his curiosity. So I think that's very important when he's comparing it to the light. It's something that you see by, and at the same time, if you try to look into it too much, if you try to think you could understand it, to bring back the example of Hegel, if you're going to, like many 19th century philosophers, try to have this complete system where now we know what love is, we know what God is, we have it within the mind's grasp. That's not only arrogant, but that will blind you, that will keep you from seeing the source. It's nothing you really can know or really know in the way we think we know regular things. And love becomes this way of seeing, this way of doing, that we see more from its effects than its innermost source, because the innermost source is something that can't be interacted with like regular things are. It means we have to have that sort of personal relationship with God, and that's something that's, go to your go to your closet, go to the hidden place and pray to your Father. That's something only between you and God. It's a subjective relationship, based on something real. It's not made up in your head, but it is truly unique and private. But from that springs things that can be seen. Any comments on that? Do you like that? Does that make more sense of it? Good. Okay. Oh, we are just marching along then. Fantastic. Oh, here we go. Let me take a look at some of the chats. I know people sometimes like to use that more than speaking out in class. Thanks, right. Take that away. Also, the morning of the relationship with God, where we can sense the authenticity of love. Yes, exactly. And I don't think Kierkegaard is necessarily saying, especially when we talk about like interfaith context, I don't think he's necessarily saying that one who is not explicitly Christian in the sense that, identifies and believes said and said things, it's like impossible for them to love. Because again, one of his main targets wasn't even necessarily secular people, but it was Christians themselves, Christians within his own country, people that went to the pews, every Sunday and, dutifully went to confession and, did all their Sunday obligations, but he would say they're still pagans, because they grew up with the assumption that this is just how things are. This isn't a choice I make. This isn't something a journey that I go into. And so for me, and this is me going off the text and maybe trying to make it more applicable for today, but I don't think for Kierkegaard, he's going to, it's not a sort of claim of Christian exclusivity in as much as that it's in the Christian. It's not something that, it's not like Christians have an exclusive right on love. God has an exclusive right on love. And God gives that as God sees fit. So it's hardly that, it's hardly impossible for an atheist to love or a Muslim to love, or et cetera, et cetera. It's more trying to put, again, it's trying to put emphasis on that love doesn't have a human source, because if it does, then it's as fickle as the wind and it doesn't really mean anything. And most importantly, it's often self-worship, self-love, egotism, rather than what we actually think of as love. So I wanted to make sure there's anything I haven't missed so far in the rest of section 1 before we maybe go to section 2. It's going to probably take up the majority of our time. I think we are about good. I know I covered the discussion guide questions. Oh yeah, so let's recognize on literally the last the last piece of text in section 1 and on page 33. Only he who abides in love can recognize love, and in the same way his love is to be known. How would you interpret that? I know it might be going over what we just talked about, but I'd like to hear it in your own words.
I think it means you don't quite understand it until you're living it, until you're living into it, until you're allowing it to become a part of who you are, not just some idea out there, but something that you're fully embodying or seeking to fully embody.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, exactly. And I like that. Embodying is a very good specific term to use with that. And again, to get back to the issue of fruits, only one that lives in the fruits of love, is doing it, can truly recognize it. And that
I think,
oh
I'm
yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
no, going ahead. No, go.
I think it's just, to me, what's most striking about this is the hiddenness and the intimacy of it, because I think even personal is too shallow a word for it. It really speaks of this being filled with or overcome by or just deeply touched by the love that is God, right? By God. And then once again, as a natural outflow of that intimate union or that intimate divine relationship, then the fruit or natural outflow of that will be love. So I can't recognize it unless it is part of my being. It's part of who I am. It is the connection and the union and the divine infilling of it, I guess. I won't know it unless and until that is my experience.
Fantastic. No, you hit the nail right on the head. Fantastic. Okay, so I am then going to go to section 2A specifically, on you shall love. So he starts off with this reflection of, he quotes from Matthew, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, and he kind of breaks it down literally word per word. And he starts off with the conception of yourself. What does it mean to love yourself? What I found most interesting, especially rereading this, was how typically when we hear that, we already seem, oh yeah, I love myself. I have a great view of myself. So I'll kind of project that onto this other person and try to love them as much as I love me. When, at least how I read him, he's trying to put the emphasis on is like, no, pretend as if they were yourself. Take the emphasis away from you. As he says, it wrests away self-love as we understand it, as egotistical love, and puts it in the other person. Love them as if they were you, as if that was your priority. I thought, and that's not to say it's self-deprecation, but it is self-renunciation. It is not starting with a high view of yourself and then getting to a high view of other people. It ultimately starts with a high view of God and then getting to a high view of other people. But the idea is that it's not starting with, numero uno, but with the other, and using the other as if they were me. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So he does in the next 2 pages talk about how it is presumptuous and wrong to try to say, can we love more than ourselves, right? And he has a few reasons why that is not the case. One, you can't. The only being that deserves love more than oneself would be God, from who all love stems, because God is the only being thing that you could put that sort of burden on, of an unquestioning devotion and obedience. Because, and he gives an example on page 36. If you truly loved someone and they're asking you to something, yep, thank you, yeah. If somebody asks you out of love to do something for them that is harmful to them, so if you have a friend who has problems with substance abuse, or is especially maybe emotionally very manipulative, they can make demands that are objectively harmful for you or for them. And so you can't have this sort of unquestioning adoration or devotion. You have to, in a sense, keep love for even one's own spouse and one's own children within the proper state of mind, and that is you're to love them as yourself, as if they were, they're on equal terms with you, and you're supposed to put that priority first. But you can't love them more than that, because to do that would almost be idolatry. It's to make them like God. But God, being a perfect eternal being, God is the only one that could sort of handle that sort of, deep, unquestioning faith versus, a very, malleable, imperfect human being. And that's not Kierkegaard being cold by any means. He goes very far, especially as we go down the chapter, into why it's so important to love everyone without exception and everyone as equals, which has a obviously pretty strong and applicable message. But it does mean that we should, again, we can't start from the assumption of the self. We can't start from the assumption of me as a human. We should start from God and understand God's relationship to myself and to others. And that's how we properly understand love and make sense of everything else. So does that distinction make sense? There's arguments against the idea of, why you shouldn't love another human more than yourself. Does that make sense? Do we agree with that, or is there criticisms of that line of argument? Okay, cool. Everyone seems to be on the same page with that. Fantastic. So let me keep going down the guide here. So yes, what makes love eternally free and independent from the response of the object? Okay, great. So now we're going to talk about dependency. Or actually, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm gonna go a little bit from the guide, and I want to talk real quick about the concept of the neighbor. So, what is the neighbor for Kierkegaard? And he makes this interesting point. I mean, the answer is everyone, all people. So that's an unconditional statement. But I find it interesting in how this example he gives of you recognize your neighbor almost as in recognizing the neighbor of yourself, or rather you recognize your duty to be a neighbor. And you know just through doing your duty who your neighbor is. So it doesn't even have to be like it doesn't even have to be an external thing. And let me try to, I know I had the quote here somewhere. Yeah, there we go. It's at the bottom of page 38. And I'm going to read this in full again, just to give you a clear context. Christ does not speak about recognizing one's neighbor, but about being a neighbor oneself, about proving oneself to be a neighbor, something the Samaritan showed by his compassion. By this, he did not prove that the assaulted man was his neighbor, but he was a neighbor of the one assaulted. The Levite and the priest are in a stricter sense neighbors of the assaulted man, but they was to ignore it. On the other hand, the Samaritan, who because of prejudice or was predestined to misunderstanding, nevertheless understood rightly that he was the neighbor of the assaulted man. Choosing a lover, finding a friend, yes, that is a long, hard job, but one's neighbor is easy to recognize, easy to find, if one himself only recognizes duty. So yeah, I found that very profound, and I know I've never thought of it that way before. I know reading the parable of the Good Samaritan, I always see the point as being, oh, okay, it's the Samaritan is the one, the Samaritan, the one that actually does God's work is the neighbor, right? Which meant something, especially to speaking of Jews at that time, because they had a sort of prejudice against Samaritans and vice versa. But the idea that the act itself, the act of doing something, makes it clear who your neighbor is a take on it I'd never heard before, and I found that very interesting. Do we have any reactions to that? Possibly any reflections or maybe examples you'd like to give of what that looks like, or maybe anything you'd like to share about your own life of kind of seeing that in play? I mean, I'll say, for example, that I'm not very good of taking care of myself. That's for sure. But I have been good, and maybe this is a sort of interesting reversal of using Kierkegaard's thought to make an application you might not expect. I have always had problems with taking care of myself personally, both psychologically, spiritually, physically. But I've never really had a problem for doing things for others. And it's almost like the sense, once I know I have an external obligation to someone else, all of a sudden things start getting done, right? Because I really can't get the idea of like loving myself. It just doesn't really compute with me. Self-improvement doesn't really compute with me that much, and just never had that kind of natural egotism, I guess. But once I internalized it as my duty, once as I thought it's like, I owe it to myself, and I only really learn what's good by doing it, is when it became apparent to me how easy it were some of my problems in my life to solve. It became easier when you almost kind of look at it from the third person. It's like, okay, this is what you're supposed to be doing. Don't fret about it in the first person. This is how you schedule yourself. This is how you're going to get out of bed today. This is going to have, this is going to have you prepare for the lecture you're going to give today, and then talk to these students about some dead Danish guy. Doing that really helped. Thinking in that mindset really helped me realize how easy some of the answers to my questions were. So that is an example I can give. Yet again, kind of turning it backwards, turning it to the self, but in a way that isn't selfish.
I really appreciate your example, Jared, and I appreciate you sharing that with us. I think some of us have probably had some similar experiences. So I appreciate your honesty or your candor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I think the other part that's helpful for me, because for me personally, I'm in my head way too much. And I think about things, and Kierkegaard is basically saying that it's only in the act of doing the love that we can become aware that it is Christian love, as opposed to, let me figure it out. What's the Christian love thing to do here? Because in some way, the love of God comes into us, and then it's like we're led by the Spirit to do the love. Yeah.
Exactly. I think I know I'm probably not the only person that had an experience with this, but I know it became a lot more easier to realize the reality of God by rather, instead of just contemplating it or going through things in my head all day, I just go out and start it. I lived on the assumption of if God exists. I lived on the assumption of if this Jesus thing is true or not, I'm going to live as if it is, and see how it works. And about 10 years later, I think I'm doing all right. So, so yeah, and it becomes more clear by that way, because when you do that, the source becomes evident to you, because the source is both inside and outside of you. It's God. It is the Spirit working in your life. You just have to let it happen, and it just becomes natural. It's like breathing. But it's not habit. We'll talk about that later, but it's not habit. But anyway, so let's get on to the next word, sal, right? You sal love. He spends a lot of time going over this, and he repeats it ad infinitum, and maybe you might have, when you're first reading this, really not understand why he was just beating your head over with this sal usage. Well, that's because, again, it's showing the act of duty. It's showing, he says it's sal is the word of royal law. It's not a conditional, it's not a maybe, it's not it might happen, it's you shall. It's pretty direct. There's really no getting around it. And we're all obligated to do it, even if we can't do it and here's the thing, you don't have to have the burden of the world on your shoulders. To love one is to love all, but you have the obligation to love, and you have the obligation to love everyone you come across, which is why sal is so important. And let's go. Don't want to skip too much here, but I also don't want to keep us left back. Let me go to the guide and we'll discuss. Yeah, what makes love free and eternally independent from the response of the object. So now we're going to talk about dependence and eternality. He hits on this a few times, but why do you think, why is it so important, do you think, for Kierkegaard that you shall love is an unconditional statement, and that it's an eternal statement? It's connected to the eternal. It's unchanging. Why do you think that? I know it's kind of almost trivial. It almost kind of sounds obvious, but you might as well state it.
Could it be because if we don't love in this way, it's kind of hard to connect with God, who is love?
Well, yeah, it certainly does. Yeah, it makes God hard to connect with. And we don't understand its true source when we make it spontaneous or temporal, something that goes along with our emotions. So you could fall in and fall out of love, which, again, for Kierkegaard, in a sense, that doesn't really compute. I mean, there's no falling in and falling out of love. You love. it's directive. Yeah, any other thoughts on that?
Shall to me is an unconditional word, so it's an unconditional duty, like you said. It's eternal, and there was another word. It's a directive. It's a command.
Yep, it is directive and a command, because here's the point with love that isn't in this love that isn't a duty, love that isn't not only a duty to yourself but a duty to everyone. Kierkegaard is making the point that love that can change is not really love at all. In fact, it can become hate very easily. It can become jealousy very easily, because he says in many ways, the dynamics of when we're looking at egotistical love, on spontaneous love, whatever you want to call it, or erotic love. And I'm sorry I haven't mentioned that yet, but erotic love, which eros in this context, erotic obviously has most application in romance and sexual love. But it could also mean love of friend, any sort of sensuous love rooted in the emotions and what I see in another as an object of adoration and love. The problem with this is that the person that hates somebody has the same amount of intensity and dedication as somebody who loves somebody. It's emotionally different, but is it really logically different? No. And I think that's the point Kierkegaard's trying to make, is love that is not eternal, love that is not based in this directive from God on high. And that's not to say it's a cold, emotionless love. He's not meaning that at all. But if you're making it captive to just the emotions, rather than doing it backwards and integrating the emotions into the command, you are really not loving. If anything, you could be setting it up for something that's very much not love. And again, it's a form of disguised self-worship, because he gives the example of adoration, right? And this, I'm going off script here, so I apologize. We're going backwards in the reading a little bit, but I think this is an important point to make, and then we'll take a break. He makes the point of adoration, that is, well, how can you say, Mr. Kierkegaard, that somebody who says they aren't completely dedicated to their wife or to their best friend, how can you say that's selfish? It's like, well, my point would be that one, you're choosing to prefer one person, just one, over all that exists, as if they're better than everyone. And second, implicit in that relationship of adoration, of love, of complete devotion that on its surface doesn't seem anything selfish at all, there is an expected return, that you'd want that devotion returned. And this is coming from somebody like Kierkegaard himself, who lived a constant life of unrequited love. So it's not as if he's judging people here. It's always kind of iffy. It can be kind of a thing to psychologize him too much, but he does seem to be speaking about Regina in a lot of his writings. In this, not as much of others, but it still seems apparent to me that he's reflecting on the nature of his own longings to be with her, and wishing that he could have had that life that for whatever reason didn't turn out, or for whatever reason he had to leave himself. The married life, and children and material comfort, just the good, happy, average Danish life of a middle-class Lutheran, that he had to reject in order to kind of seek the truth and learn what it meant to be a Christian in his age. So any reflections on that, any reactions to that before I think we all deserve a break? I know I need to have my coffee, so.
Well, thank you, Jared. Yes, let's go ahead and take a quick break. Can we take like a 10-minute break? Is that okay? And then we'll finish up a little early too. Okay,
Sounds good.
that work for everybody? Okay. Thanks, Jared. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. How about you?
Okay. But I mean, are you feeling okay about the class and everything?
Oh yeah, no, I'm doing fine. Sorry, I'm a bit disorganized. I kind of go off the cuff when I have a good thought, but since I'm
Yeah,
kind of
it's
balancing,
fine. Just
know.
want to make sure we get the things in there that need to be said. That's all.
right. So yeah, let me actually, while they're breaking, I'm going to look over the study guide. I talked a little bit about it, especially on kind of touching on the admiration point. I went there, kind of off on a tangent there in the end. But let's get back to the guide and let's talk about preferential love again and Christian love. We've already talked about a few of these, what the difference is between them. And here I'm just using spontaneous love, preferential love, erotic love is broadly the same thing, in that it's something that comes from the emotions from the self. It's that feeling of being in love or that feeling of finding a friend, et cetera, versus Christian love that roots itself in God and the command that you shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. If we're going to list 4 main points of contention or contrast between them, the first one I would say is temporality. It's eternal versus temporal, right? And he talked about that in the last section. Your emotions come and go with the wind. Some days you'll be happy, some days you'll be sorrowful. You can never count on him. The same thing is, some days you'll have nice, warm, fuzzy feelings about your spouse. Other days you will be mad as hell at them. You could even have it for your own children or your own best friends. I mean, we're human. There's no way to expect it to be otherwise. But then if love is dependent upon that, then that love is very unshaky in its foundations. Versus Christian love is based in the eternal command, you shall love, right, in God. Another point of contention is going with that, Kierkegaard calls it the middle term, the sort of mediator in this relationship of love. The mediator in preferential love is preference. What makes me love another or not is my preference for them. I like somebody, I realize I have something in common with them. It's like, oh, you like, you were kind of like an underemployed person in their 20s that has an obsession with mostly obscure metaphysics and generally not being of use to society. Oh, hey, I'm Jared. Nice to meet you. Oh, I have something in common with that person. I got to be friends with them. And of course, that's very natural, but that isn't love. Versus Christian love, the mediator is God. I should love that person because I know God loves that person. And he also talks about when recognizing your neighbor, it's hard to you don't know who you're going to fall in love with, not until you meet him, not until that just happens. But it's easy to recognize your neighbor. You recognize your neighbor. So there's an obligation to it, which goes into my next point. The next point of contrast is ethical obligations. When describing in section 2, he talks about, he just uses the term the poet, which I know can be a little bit confusing because it's just so broad. Is he talking about a specific person? I mean, given his time and his education, you can mostly assume Greek poets, the classics of Homer and the dramatists and the like. But even Christian poets, as he makes the case too, are still stuck in this pagan mindset that does overemphasize what we call preferential love and don't seem to truly understand Christian love, or at least they can't express it as a poet. The poet looks at love as more of a thing of fortune. You meet the person you're supposed to be with. It's fortune has smiled upon you this day. It's not something you should do or you can do. It's more of like, oh man, wouldn't that be nice if that happened today? Oh, it's what a great change in fortune. Versus Christian love is an obligation. Christian love is something that we can immediately recognize and immediately apply. So it's an ethical obligation. It's telling that shall is a should. It's not just telling us how things are, but how things should be. It's a normative statement. Which is what to be called philosophically. It's a normative statement rather than a purely descriptive one. And let's see. I've already gone over self-renunciation quite a bit, but I would say, and the last point of contrast is ultimately self-renunciation versus egotism. So we are doing a little bit of a review here. The self is the source of preferential love, and God is the source of Christian love. and not by hating yourself, but by decentering yourself from that love and loving all equally. That's the way to Christian love. So what I found kind of first time I read this was a little bit of tension with Kierkegaard. It sounded like he's kind of, I get where he's saying. I definitely agree that love should be something that comes and goes with the wind. It's not something based on what I get out of it, but he's almost kind of defanging everything, or he's kind of like making everything too cerebral. It almost makes things sound impersonal, like it's a sort of cold love. Like I love you like intellectually. And because I love everyone equally, the fact that there's no preference seems to be like, I don't love you for any particular reason. It almost seems to be unloving in a way. But I think that's the wrong way to read Kierkegaard. And they talk about it in the foreword. I think that's a wrong way to read Kierkegaard, because he's not disparaging what we call preferential and erotic love per se, but he is heavily criticizing anything that attempts to compromise or root Christian love in anything else than the Tao. So the best way to look at it is when you look at your marriage, you look at your friendships, you look at everything you do in your life. There's nothing wrong with having that sort of emotional attachment. I mean, you should, obviously. But at the end of the day, you have to understand, I love this person because God loves them. And it is my duty to love them back and do everything I can for them. Especially if, and in this specific example, it's in my marriage, or it's in with my best friend, or it's within somebody I know who struggles with something, whether it be substance abuse or poverty or the like. And now the last point will be application, but I just want to stay on this for a little bit longer. Excuse me. But yeah, so my apologies. I just forgot where I was going to go with that. But as you can see, the application becomes quite clear when we're using words like equality. He ends the chapter off by talking about, actually, what, I'm going to read it again because it's just a very good line. Starts at the very end of 71 and then goes to 72. Of course, a certain courtness and social intercourse, politeness towards all men, friendly condescension to the poor, a frank attitude towards the mighty, a beautifully controlled freedom of spirit. Yet in education, do you think this is also loving one's neighbor? So I think that that's in many ways when we talk about, I can be a good person on my own. I have it all figured out. In many ways, that's often what it kind of turns to. That becomes the sort of worldly love. A condescension to the poor, a sort of politeness, a sort of fashionableness, versus in Kierkegaard's love, not only do you love the poor, you are kept from treating the poor as your inferior. You have to treat them as your equal, and you're kept from treating anybody as your superior. You have to treat them as an equal. I mean, Kierkegaard himself, from what we know, he wasn't very political by today's standards, but from what we know, he was actually kind of conservative in the meaning of his time, not in the American sense, more of like a moderate kind of monarchist. But it doesn't really take long to get the gears churning and see how this should apply to how we act in our communities and our churches, and collectively, even as a country. When you are forced to no longer have preference over ethnicity, over class, over religion, over anything, even people you think are disgusting and evil, even people I can't stand, like especially these days, with like people being on, far right extremist groups or the like. We have to find a way to really love and engage with them as equals. And that's hard. That's not easy. And you don't want to, by loving one, disparage another. You don't want to just give free rein to, Mr. Unapologetic racist while not, giving that same time to your friends of color. It's because that becomes a double standard in itself. You're treating one as a superior and one as an inferior. And I bring up these kind of controversial questions because I think that's what really matters most when you're reading this. It's the application. This can be confusing because Kierkegaard is purposely confusing sometimes. But it becomes clear, as he says, that this is a Christian discourse, and a Christian discourse is if you're going to read it slowly and practice it. If you try to do it rash, you try to understand it, you try to get the bullet points of it, you're not going to get it. It takes a lifetime to get it. So I think that's what makes it most powerful. And we got to apply, again, dead Danish guy that kind of writes in complicating ways and, not always understanding the references he's making is very applicable today because he's getting something that is beyond himself, which is the truth, that goes all the way back to the Gospels themselves, that you'll know them by their fruits. And that he who has no fruits has no faith. And its faith is known in love, not in any sort of belief or physical identifier one way or the other. So that's why I think Kierkegaard's so powerful, and why he's definitely influenced me. As one who tends to be more of the speculative, stuck in their head type, I purposely focus on him because he keeps me out of getting too much. I'm more like, in many ways, I'm more of a Hegel. I'm more of a system maker. I'm more of an analytic type. But Kierkegaard keeps me grounded in not a practical way, more than that, in a personal way, in a lived way that doesn't try to figure everything out before it's happened, but instead tries to rely on God and tries to rely on living actual life. Another great quote of his that's not in here is life must be, life is thought of backwards, but it must be lived forwards. And that's why I think, he's one of the greatest intellects to really walk the face of the earth. God certainly gave him wisdom. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Thank you for dealing with my ranting and incoherent jumping from point to point. Any questions, comments, concerns?
I just wondered, did he, how did he practice what he wrote?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I don't know enough biographical details to be sure. I think he showed that primarily. If you look in his journals, how he dealt with those that were closest to him, and also in his sort of near the end of his life, ironically enough, you can call it love, his criticisms of the Church of Denmark, and his criticisms of Christendom as a whole. I don't know, Helene, you probably have a better example of this, but because obviously he was a rather introverted person. And I think, I'm sorry, Jackie, I'll get to your comments in a second. I think you made a good point. I feel like you're saying these equals.
Yeah, so just to interrupt you, Jared, for a second. Kierkegaard lived, he was more solitary, but he always took a walk, and he always went on a walk around where he lived, and he was always listening to and engaging with everybody he meets. Even though he writes a lot, I don't think he talked a lot. I think he was more interested in listening to people. Like, he would ask them questions.
Mm-hmm.
And some of that we get when we read his works, where you get where he comes up with some of the witticisms are really from his engagement with people around him. And I would say that he is primarily known as being critical of the church for being focused on things that he thinks are not relevant to what the gospel message is. And that does have to do with love. But he's also concerned about how we don't think some people have the faith and some people don't. So Christian love is to love the one you meet, love the one you see, love the one you're with, so to speak. The other point is, I think he's not that he's using it in a negative connotation, but I think he's trying to let go of the feelings that he has for Regina that are personal, and I shouldn't say they're personal. Of course they're personal, but they're preferential. Is what they are. So he's trying to transform the preferential love that he has for Regina into the Christian love. And so recognizing that when he left her, he leaves her at a time when she's in love with him, but he recognizes that he's what they call melancholy, and that melancholy is, I think he probably has seasonal affective disorder. When he, if you read his works, they're, fear and trembling, sickness unto death. Anyway, he doesn't want her to suffer. He says something about being an eternity too old for her. He doesn't want to bring her down. And so I think he thinks of that as one of his works of love. And then he's trying to work that out.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Jared.
No, that's excellent. No, so yeah. So I think, and James and Jackie get to a similar point. It's just, it's the difficulty of saying, okay, yeah, everybody's equal. I love them in the abstract, but how does that actually mean? And we all know people are different, do different things, and you don't want to excuse bad conduct, right? You don't want to. And it kind of also goes to the point of why you can't love anybody more than yourself, because if you do a sort of uncritical devotion to another, you can excuse ways that are objectively hurting them or objectively hurting others. So the hardest part is what that looks like. And that's really not a question I can answer for you. I mean, that's even not a question Kierkegaard would answer for you. Maybe to bring this all back to the beginning. And I mean, when you think of the prayer, it's a process with you and God. Kierkegaard is not going to give you the answer in this book or in many books. What I haven't mentioned yet is this book he wrote in his own name. A lot of the books, especially the ones he's most known for, he wrote, a little bit earlier, were written under pseudonyms. So made up names like Johann di Silencio, John the Silent One, Anticlimacus, all these odd pseudonyms. He even had one where he wrote his own name as the editor, but then he wrote it under a pseudonym. It was literally just written by him, but he made it kind of look like this sort of charade of he was editing it for another person. And he does that not because he was trying to, get away or feared being censored because of what he was writing. He was saying that these are just voices in a dialogue that I am having with that individual, the reader. And even Kierkegaard, even when he writes in his own name, he's kind of just another voice. He's not going to tell you the truth. He's going to try to lead it to you. But he's going to often leave the most important point unsaid, and you kind of have to figure that out. It's just kind of like in some of the parables Christ gives, he leaves the sort of the most important point unsaid, but it's lingering there. You can tell it. So yeah, it's that process of finding the truth, and Kierkegaard would hope that he can maybe help that or maybe problematize that, but problematize it in a good way. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jared. I mean, I do think he leaves the punchline out because he wants you to come to the punchline, you as the reader, because he believes that Christian truth cannot be taught. It has to be learned. So, and it's learned maybe from being put into such situations and reading and learning. Internally digesting what the values of love are. But how do you live as a Christian in this particular instance? That's something that is discerned by love and by acting, rather than figuring out what's the best thing to do. I think he probably had a similar experience of getting stuck and trying to figure out what to do and then not even doing anything. I don't know if anybody else has had that experience, but the point for him is the action, and the action is really where the truth is known and experienced. I did want to notice a couple points. I mean, some folks mentioned that it's loving everyone equally is difficult, and I'm not sure that it's possible for us. One of the things that Kierkegaard says is that with God everything is possible. So what he wants to say there, what I mean by that is we can't do it on our own, and when we try to do it on our own, we realize it's impossible. we need God we need to follow God, or need God to love God and allow us to have our hearts formed and shaped by that love to be able to love our neighbors. Another point is that when we love someone, if we're talking about loving people equally, it doesn't mean treating them equally. I think it's James was saying something about teachers and kids. People learn differently. So to love someone doesn't mean that you give everybody the same tests, or you give all the kids the same tests and expect them to do all the same. Sometimes loving someone, a particular person here, is doing the opposite of what you did in this situation. So it's not something simple at all. And when he says equally, no, he doesn't say equally. He says without our preference, but rather with the divine, the eternal equality, which is a different kind of equality, right? Because in the eyes of the eternal, and when we are in the bosom of the eternal, the differences between us are negligible. But we don't live in the eternal. We live here. So really, for Kierkegaard, the idea is how to help the neighbor be loved and find God. How to help the neighbor find God. Because I know that my love is inadequate, but God's love is adequate, is more than adequate. And that looks different for each situation, I think. And I agree that we still need to have boundaries. I mean, and we can also be critical of Kierkegaard and say, well, so one of the questions that often comes up, and for next time we'll be in small groups and we'll chat some more about this, is Christian love start with loving God, and then by loving God we can love our neighbors? Or do we love God by loving the ones we see, our neighbors in front of us? Because loving God, what does that mean, loving God? I mean, one might ask, what does that mean, loving God? Going to church, piety? I mean, we're talking about this connection between piety and good works, or loving works. So for Kierkegaard, he's definitely putting the piety first. He's definitely putting loving God first, and then being able to love the neighbor. Someone else, and I think Wesley is kind of on the edge here, where we're loving God by showing love to our neighbors, as opposed to we're loving our neighbors by loving God. Does the distinction make sense to people?
Right, absolutely. I wanted to actually get to it. Oh, sorry, go on ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I didn't know if anybody else was trying to speak, but okay. So Zach made a comment I think makes a lot of sense. Could it be seen as equal application or equal effort towards loving people? And I think I would agree with that. I think it's whatever unique way that unique to that person's situation, or nevertheless not preferring how much you love people, even if you understand it's going to look different ways. Because I do worry when we do speak about boundaries and the like. Because as if anybody who has drug addicts in their family, I've had plenty of heroin addicts and opiate addicts that led to a death of a cousin not too long, a few years back. It's incredibly frustrating and incredibly hard that you have to almost set boundaries, but at the same time is really just distancing myself from all the problems in that family, actually loving them. I mean, to me, the only thing I worry about that is that becomes a convenient rationalization. It's just like when, I think this is anecdotal, but one of the rationales for like executing people in the Middle Ages is just like we're showing our love of God and our love of justice by killing you right now. Like, that you could really rationalize anything by saying, well, this is loving them in a different way. because love sometimes is irrational, at least by human standards. And it means going that extra mile and being ready to give yourself to it completely. And that's just speaking from my own experience, that I worry I can too conveniently rationalize other people away and say I love them in some bizarrely abstract way without really doing anything.
Looks like there's a lot of great stuff on the chat. Okay, so Amber, what are you saying here?
So Wesley said, if you think of a bullseye, right, you have a center spot, that's love. And then the concentric circle on the outside of love is your works of piety. So it would be like love of neighbor, the actual doing part of the compassion and justice. And then on the outside of that would be works of piety, which is the devotion and worship. So to your point, Dr. Russell, yes, I think Wesley saw you're showing love to God by your actions pointed towards your neighbor.
Yes, which is not what Kierkegaard's saying.
Right.
Kierkegaard's saying your duty is to love God first, and only as you love God are you able to love your neighbors in the right way, properly. And that's the question. I mean, that's one of the questions to reflect upon. And, you know, I don't know that there's the right answer. And that's one of the things that we might reflect upon.
And it's actually an active question within the United Methodist Church, which takes precedence. Does one take precedence?
Yeah. Yeah. Or is one done through the other? Yeah. So for Kierkegaard, I mean, part of that then becomes, so theologically speaking, part of this is because of their tradition's view of what it means to be human and the impact that sin has upon a person. So for Kierkegaard, following in the Lutheran tradition, the Protestant tradition, sin has impacted a person's ability to know what's good, let alone to do what's good. So loving God is the priority, because otherwise you might think you're loving your neighbor when in fact you're not. Whereas Wesley's understanding, I think it's hard to pin down Wesley because he's kind of on the elements of both. He has elements of both, right? But I think he does fall on the love is there to begin with because of prevenient grace. And so when you act out of love, when you act in a way that seems like love to you, it might not be perfect, but you're moving in the right direction. And, so it's almost more like God, where you have, I believe, help my unbelief. For Wesley, it's I love, help my unlove. Whereas for Kierkegaard, it's I have a hard time loving my neighbor because they drive me crazy. God, help me love them. If that makes sense. I'm loving all the conversation here. Does anybody want to share anything more and get responses? Out loud? It's fine if you don't. I mean, it's interesting to note how the chat has become such a important tool for learning and discussion. So
I think the chat gives you time to think about, like I like to think about what I'm going to say before I say it. And so the chat gives me time to work out my thoughts and then say it.
Yeah.
Right.
Good. Well, and does anybody want to respond to anybody's chats?
Jared, I appreciate your vulnerability on your example. I think that's what I was getting at with when you're having to love somebody who is hurtful at the same time.
Yeah,
is Kierkegaard saying just
thing, yeah.
love them anyway, and this is how you love them and stay in it, or is Kierkegaard saying love them knowing that God loves them, but you're not God. So, you don't have to, what is the balance there? And so I appreciate your help.
Absolutely. No, that's a question I'm still wondering. So thank you.
Well, I think that having boundaries is really important. And I don't think Kierkegaard would disagree. For him, sometimes loving, I mean, he'll say it in the text. I don't know if you've gotten to that part or not in your reading, but he'll say sometimes loving your neighbor as God wants them to be loved is to show them the ways in which they're wrong, or to not do what it is that they want you to do, because that's not what's either good for them. I mean, as if I know what's good for other people, but from a divine perspective, or even good for you. I mean, so if you're looking at the question of the addict, I think it's easier to discern that if you're not an addict, and see what the addict is saying. If you love me, you give me money for whatever, or you'd enable me. And that's very different than loving, which is to show the truth of the person, which may be really difficult to do. And maybe the only way that person can find that truth is not enabling them. And how that happens, I'm not an expert there at all. I'm just giving that as an example of the ways in which we might think of something as lovey-dovey. I mean, as love, as if it were lovey-dovey or being nice to people. And that's not what Kierkegaard's saying about being nice to people. He's not saying be nice to people.
And someone mentioned drawing boundaries, and that almost like, that boundary is a negative in that, but showing people how to take care of themselves is a very loving thing to do. And boundaries are very appropriate. We all need boundaries. And so being a role model for people, and doing it in a loving way is, and I worked with addicts for years, and that was one of the things that we tried to help families to understand was, not doing it you're not doing it in a selfish way, but to just role model what is healthy for you often helps them to see what will be healthy for them.
That's an excellent point. Thank you for sharing that.
I just want to piggyback off of what you were saying too, Dr. Russell, as far as addiction, and give a shout out to Zach for what he had put in the comments about the effort, and the effort that you sometimes you may need to draw closer to somebody versus keeping your distance. And I was just thinking on an individual level, as far as like I've had family and friends that have dealt with addiction, and it's interesting how, like, just for one person, you're so wanting to help them and get into an environment that they can start living positively and get away from what they're addicted to, and try to get into rehab and putting money towards them, or trying to do certain things like that. And then in some cases, and it could be that same individual actually, like you put so much into them that you're finally like, there's nothing I can do that is going to help you in this way. But if I give you this space, this space is maybe what you really needed. Because me trying to push the narrative isn't working. And then stepping away is an effort in itself, and it may be hard for us to see this individual and not be able to do anything to help. And that is what helps them get through on their own. Like that, they no longer have that crutch, so they have to rely on God or something else to get them to change instead of just relying on us. And so when I was thinking of it like that, I'm like, okay, I see there's effort on both ends. But now Zach has me walking on this tightrope, because I still don't know if that effort can be neighbor to neighbor, because it's like, okay, for this individual, every case is a little bit different for me. you know, again, it's like for this individual, because of the relationship that we've had or grown and the way I know them or yada, 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 I'm willing to go through this amount of effort or go through this struggle. Like if this is my, say if this is my son or something, I'm gonna go, you know, jump through all the hoops, you know, flip over the world, carry whatever. Whereas if this is somebody who I just recently met and I just found this out, I'm not having as much of a, like I may be, my heartstring may be pulled, but it's not like I'm necessarily willing to go through all the same efforts or trouble to see this person through. And not in a bad way. I still love them. But I guess it doesn't, I don't know what to call it. It's not deeply rooted for someone else to give that type of effort. So that's kind of where I'm like,
I appreciate you sharing that very much, James. I think it's a great example of what Kierkegaard is saying. That's what we do. Like what you're describing, that's what we do. And he is actually suggesting that the love you have for a child or for someone you're close to, that ends up being kind of a that ends up what you describe as preferential love. So to be able to do that for someone that you're not in a close relationship with, well, let me stop. It's preferential in that you're also really invested in it. It's not just about the well-being of this person or them making the right decision. You're also very invested in the life of your child. You're invested in the life of this person that you're connected to. And he's not saying that's wrong. He's just saying it's really hard to imagine what would it be like, and not just imagine, but to act in such a way that everyone you meet, you treat like that. So one thing, so some people would say, oh, he's saying treat everybody equally, everyone's your neighbor. First, he's not saying treat everyone equally. He's saying love everyone equally. But that may be treating them in ways that are very different because people may need different things at different times. And second, he's not wanting you to stop loving your child. Right? He's not wanting you to stop putting effort into the child or the brother or the cousin or whoever it is that you're having your heartstrings just broken with their pain. He's suggesting that Christian love has that for all, for the one you meet. So not for all, just generally. I mean, and remember, he's in Copenhagen in the 19th century. So there's not a lot of people that he sees, right? I mean, it's not like thinking about people in a different part of the country even, because he doesn't have that connection, right? It's whoever you run into, like who do you see and what is it they need and how to help them. I'm not saying he's correct. I'm just articulating his position. I think it's a hard position. Sometimes I think it's an ideal that's worth moving toward. Other times, I'm not sure.
and that's kind of what my thoughts were on it as well, as far as like, this is a nice ideal. This would be great, especially if everyone could live like that, and you know, it being done through God's love, that we can love others in that way. What I've thought, again, towards just the amount of effort you have to put into it, but also just thinking to like the biblical text, as far as like Jesus saying in John that there's no greater love than a friend no greater love than to lay down your life for one's friend, right? And so for us to have the kind of love that we treat everyone equally on that level, that we would give our love, like we would lay down our life just for anyone almost. That's scary to me. I would be afraid, especially if it's not the whole world. If it's the whole world we're loving like this, oh, that's ideal. That's great. But say I could just trying to imagine only one person in the world that loved like that, I I would be scared, um, because as courageous and as miraculous that would be, for someone just walking down the street, and it's actually been done. Um, but like, say somebody's robbing, the McDonald's or whatever else, and somebody just jumps in front of a bullet for that person. Like, that's amazing. But it also would be, for me, that's a scary act
Yeah.
to do for someone you wouldn't know.
Right. I think that's a great example, James. And because I think, and I think you're right. I think it is sort of the unreachable ideal. And in that, and acknowledging how I fail to meet that, and acknowledging how in my sense I fail to love, I even hate, I get angry, I murder someone in my heart, and in acknowledging that, I acknowledge my own sinfulness and my own need for grace. And the only natural response, right, is from being given grace, is that you have to in turn give that grace to others. So it sort of does this weird loop where it kind of self-justifies in a way. It'll never be reachable, especially on our own in this life. But precisely because of that is why we need to keep doing that, because we won't, and we can't really, we can't find a vantage point where we're totally okay and everybody's not, right? I think really the only thing that when we make it an ideal is that we don't want to just section it off as like a sort of pie in the sky. Or it's like, well, one day it will be that way, after we die or in heaven or what have you, or after the resurrection. It is, because we should always be thinking of it how we're going to apply it immediately to our circumstances, right? And I think that was a great example you give. It is scary. And then what if you have a family? It's like, is it kind of selfish for me to die for a stranger and not, my family have to deal with me not being around? It's difficult. It's hard to really know how that works. And I know I think about that a lot. So.
Yeah. So I think what Kierkegaard does is he gives us a lot to reflect upon and think about. The context of the Lutheran tradition and the power of sin, as opposed to the power of love, the power of sin in the Lutheran tradition, and even in Kierkegaard's particular family, with his father being such he's a pietist, so he's kind of got a little of the Wesley stuff there, but he understands sin and guilt with such gravity and gravitas that I think it impacts Kierkegaard here, where he's saying, I can't do, when I try to figure it out, I don't do it well. And he's understanding, I don't think he thinks that, oh, now that you know that you're supposed to love, then you'll automatically love. And when you don't love, you're evil, right? That's the thing about the Lutherans, is that it's not that you're a sinner and you're evil. It's that everyone's a sinner and you're imperfect. You're going to fail. And the only way you can move forward is with God, all things are possible. And that's the only way it is. With God, all things are possible. And it might be that some of you may have had this experience. I know I have a few times where I will do something I've done something that's absolutely just out of an immediate sense of care and love for another person. Not someone I was in a relationship with, not someone that I wanted to be friends with. it and it reflecting upon it, it's just divine grace that somehow I was in that moment, I was in synchronicity with God. And it has nothing to do with me. It has simply to do with almost a surrender of, I just acted out of God's grace. So let's look at this text, not so much about, oh, you can't do that, or you didn't do that, you're bad, or something. He already assumes we're all sinners and we're all imperfect, we're all infallible. I mean, fallible. I don't know if that helps or not. Wesley has a different view, a different assumption about what we can do and what we can't do.
I wanted to respond kind of to James. Some years ago, after the accident that took my family, I really came to kind of and calls, and being Catholic, call was not a language I was used to, but I just kind of came to I'm just being called to love the person in front of me. And that is a lot of energy, to love the person in front of you all the time, to feel that the need to do that. But I did. I mean, that's what I felt called to. And very quickly, and fortunately, my father was an educator, my mom was a nurse, and I watched them care for people throughout my life. And very quickly, I realized that that call also had to have a creative side to it. And so I realized that I had to recognize that I can't do everything for everybody all the time. I can't, I can act in love as much as possible, but everything that Dr. Russell was saying, I am totally human. I get mad, I get all that stuff. There are people I don't like. As much as I want to be Christian, there are people I simply don't like in this world. But that doesn't mean that I can't act out of love. But we where our church is, we get people off the highway all the time asking for money, and everybody's just in a panic over we don't have these resources, and I could empty my bank account. I'm just that person. They need help. We've got to do it. And so, but I just realized very quickly that to be that person that loved all the time and address those needs, I have to be creative. I have to find ways to say, okay, we're here. This is the need. We're going to find some way to address it the best we can. Not, oh, I have to empty my checking account immediately because there's that need. So I just went into action, finding resources. My jobs, every telephone call that I get is somebody in pain. I don't get a telephone call that is not, but every person has their own story, and just the willingness to stop trying to save people and realize that all I can ever offer is my presence. I can't put myself in front of that bullet every time, because I have one life. And if I put myself in front of that bullet every time, I've only saved one person, or I've only done, one thing. But this is what I have to offer, and this is who I am. And God will do whatever work with that God has once done. And to be willing to just present, this is me, I'm just human, but yeah, I'll listen on this phone, or yeah, I'll stand in that room with you, or whatever it was. That's my offering of love. Instead of trying to, oh, I got to do this and I got to do this. Hey, this is who I am, and this is the love I have to offer, and without draining everything I have. I had to realize that really quickly. So when you're talking about, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? And all that stuff, just simply saying, God, this is my situation. I want to do, act in love. All I have is me. Make it enough. And God will. Don't feel like you have to throw yourself in front of that bullet, because you do, and you've given it all for one person, where there's a lot of people that need that love.
Yes, Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Very good words of wisdom that sometimes the love is often being present, not fixing the problem for somebody, because that doesn't really help them in the end, unless it's your child, right? Because, I mean, you have a different relationship with your child than you do with the stranger you see on the street. That doesn't mean, what Kierkegaard is saying, you just shouldn't treat everybody exactly the way you treat your child, or have responsibilities to everyone like you do to your child, but you should love. And love may very well be being present to hear, to listen, to just sit with somebody. I can't fix you. I can't heal you. I can't give you the money so you can get the surgery, but I can be here and listen. I can be God's ear and God's love. I mean, I think life shows us that God doesn't do that either. God doesn't like jump in front of the bullet. God doesn't fix every person that is suffering. But God's present with us. We're not alone. We're never alone. We don't go through it, we go through alone. And with another person with us, that makes a big difference. So yeah, I see Mary Beth is, yes, okay, yes, thank you. Sorry, go ahead, James.
I was just gonna add, thank you, Mary Beth, for what you were saying. That also made me think of something that I was forgetting in my own mind too, because I'm gonna relate this kind of to tithing, because we don't take in, or at least I wasn't taking in consideration to our own state of being. And so like, kind of like tithing, say a rich man gives, his 10% or whatever, but then the poor woman who barely has a dime to her name gives 90%, right? Um, and I was just thinking of like our state of being, like at certain times we're able to give more. Like the effort may be the same across the board for us sometimes, but it's what can we give from where we're at right now, right? So if I'm firing on all cylinders, I got life going on great or whatever, I can do more for those around me and show that abundance of love. But when I'm in a state of like, hey, I'm struggling over here, I can't give you the same as I gave before, but I'm still giving you at my best, right? So you're still giving at your best in both scenarios, but you're just incapable of it just doesn't look the same. Again, going back to what we've mentioned a few times, it just looks different. But that effort of love is still there, and that was something that kind of resonated as you were talking, Mary Beth, that I was thinking about. I was like, it's still the same, but it looks different.
Well, and don't forget yourself. You're a neighbor, you love yourself as a neighbor as well.
Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, my boyfriend just came with my prescription. So I was talking to him.
Oh,
I'm outside. So this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate it very much. Any last comments anybody has to say?
well, it was great meeting you all, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to come and speak to class today about one of my favorite subjects, and appreciate everybody's comments and responses and being good listeners. So I hope to see you in classes soon, and especially once this pandemic is over. So you'll see me around.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
Jared.
Jared. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jared.
So everybody else, if you have any other questions or comments, please feel free to make them. Otherwise, we will be continuing our conversation about Kierkegaard for next week. We also have a small group discussion where I've created a situation, a church situation, and I'm inviting you to reflect upon how you might apply Kierkegaard's understanding of love. And then we'll also talk a little bit about how love upbuilds, which is a really important element of what Kierkegaard has to say. And any other points that you read and get in the reading, I asked you to specifically look at the work of love in Loving One Who's Dead, which is an unusual, a little section there, an unusual thing perhaps, but I think I find it profound. So let's take a look at that as well. And then we'll see you next week, unless anybody has any other comments. By the way, what's behind me is Frau Kirk, which was Kierkegaard's church. So anyway, so, got to have the background match the class. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Feel better.
Bye.
Feel better.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So, and Amber, let's connect tomorrow. Or if you have any comments or questions,